Hi ladies, Rachel LaFleur here. For anyone who's new in the class, this is my uh, fourth class in this series, and I've been enjoying it and I'm thankful for it. My husband and I are both NOBTS Flex students through the Caskey Foundation, and that's a blessing we are very thankful for as well. He is the full-time preacher of our church, and he also works full-time in the civilian world. I lead the children's ministry and the song singing and help with, secretarial things and all that in between. And we also have 6 kids whom I homeschool, so I stay crazy and busy. So if anybody has ever, said anything in discussion board or, noticed that I don't really type in there too much, is probably because I don't have a lot of time to sit down and just talk. So, but don't let that deter you. I've found in 5 years of being a minister's wife that there are some things and relationships that only fellow ministry wives can understand, and just to continue to cultivate those relationships in this class is something that I look forward to. So email me, message me, whatever, and I will get back to you. It might take a minute, but I will. So there's my introduction, and it's a blessing to be in this class. It's a blessing to see all of you on the other side of my screen, and I hope to get to know you all better. So here is my retelling. In the beginning, God created land, water, and sky. Then he made the sun, moon, and stars that float by. Next came the animals and plants that God said would fill the earth with his songs and dance. But the crown of creation was woman and man. God created them to be their loving friend. God said it was good, and he was right. It was perfect. There was nothing out of place, no funky smells, no reason to fuss and fight. There were no weeds to pull and no killing for meat. It was beautiful. There was no sweat and no defeat. Man had fellowship with God that was open, honest, and pure, the way God had planned. They would walk together and talk together daily in the land. God gave man one command to obey. This garden isn't all-you-can-eat buffet, but this one tree is only for display. If you eat from it, you will die, he did convey. Satan tempted man, who rebelled and broke the command. He deceived Eve by telling her God lied, so she took the fruit into her hand. She ate it and then gave it to her husband, who didn't take a stand. He didn't listen to God. Instead, he did as his wife did demand. With the fall, man's fellowship with God was broken, for he is holy and can't dwell among men whose sin nature had awoken. God removed them from the garden, and everyone was heartbroken. But as discipline was handed out, Satan's defeat was forspoken. The world is changed by sin and its consequences. The land, animals, and man will all have new experiences, now facing things such as weeds, disease, and pestilences. The penalty of death also now commences. God planned for redemption and has a plan for salvation. He knew this would happen before the earth's formation. Until his son could pay the final compensation, the sacrifice of a lamb would be the adaptation. Redemption begins through his covenant with Abraham, because God tested his faith and he passed every exam. God calls Abraham and makes 3 promises to him: that he would be the father of many, their blessings won't be slim, and there's a special land he's set aside just for them. Abraham believes God, and it's credited to his righteousness, not because he was perfect, because honestly he was a mess. His flesh got him into trouble. He had a child with a mistress, but this was not the son of a promise that God had intended to bless. God faithfully begins his promise of a people through a miracle birth. Abraham's wife Sarah thought she had outlived her childbearing worth, but God opened her womb, and soon little Isaac was walking the earth. The children of Abraham ended up serving as slaves in Egypt. Generations after Joseph saved the nations, the Egyptians flipped the script. Now they worked in houses, built pyramids, and were consistently whipped. The Israeli people call out to God, and he hears their plea. He then sets into play his plan for setting them free. The I Am raises up Moses to step out as a leader. Ironically, this Jew was raised in Pharaoh's house, and his loyalty did teeter. Though he was trained in all their ways, it was like living in a heater. Just watching the Hebrews be abused topped off his tolerance meter. He ran away after taking an Egyptian's life for being an excessive Jew beater. God makes a covenant with Moses after he fled into the desert. God spoke through a burning bush, which did cause Moses to convert. The covenant with Abraham was what God did assert would hold true through Moses after the Pharaoh he did subvert. God rescues his people and destroys many Egyptian forces. He sent 10 plagues their way, using his boundless sources. After the last plague, Pharaoh sent Israel packing with all their resources, and decided to recapture them as the Egyptians' heart changed courses. But God drowned him, their armies, and all their horses. God gives his commands through Moses at Mount Sinai. They were rules in which God wanted man to live by. Laws such as love God, don't kill, honor your parents, and don't lie are in whole impossible, but show that it's in God we must rely. These are terms by which they can experience blessing in the land God promised and have the holy God dwelling in their midst. They would have to follow them, or the presence of God and the land would be missed. Atonement for sins is instituted by shedding a lamb's blood each year. Those who fell short in obeying the law now had nothing to fear. This sacrifice would pay their sin debt, and their names would then be clear. The people turned to idol worship almost immediately. It was before Moses even returned to give them God's decree. While he was on the mountaintop, to a golden calf they bent their knee. They apparently forgot that it was God who gave them liberty. This generation sadly trusts in their own power, not in God's, despite his doing miracle and getting their applause. In a flash they'd forget and whine, and they'd be at odds. The oldest among them are told they won't enter the promised land because their faithless acts of sin while refusing God's hand. They would have to die in the wilderness while wandering the desert sand. To a new generation, God did reiterate his commands to them in Deuteronomy 28. The covenant with Abraham and Moses he did reinstate. These were the promises that he would not negate. God uses Joshua to lead them to the promised land at last, fulfillment of God's vow made to the fathers in generations past. God's people were to destroy the Canaanites of the land. However, they let many of them live and looted against God's command. The temptation to kneel to idols was more than they could stand. For them to live as Canaanites was not what God had planned. The land was then distributed amongst Abraham's seed. From greatest to smallest, God told Joshua how to proceed, to give everyone their own space as was guaranteed. The people become just as wicked as the Canaanites after Joshua dies. Their sin and idolatry was now steadily on the rise. Then the people want a king just like the nations all around them. They don't care that the consequence of their choice was grim. God tells Samuel the priest to hearken unto them and anoint a king. They want someone who will get them gains and be of their liking. But a heart who loved God was the key trait of the man Samuel did bring. The first king, Saul, fails to trust God and acted like a fool. He disobeyed, rushed, and used God's priest like a tool. He didn't follow God's law, so he lost his right to rule. The second king, David, trusts God and restores his prayer and praise. He bids the people to turn back to God and walk in all his ways. He is known as a man after God's own heart, even in our current days. God promises that David's throne will be established forever, even until God returns and we are all gathered up together. Reestablishment of a righteous nation seems like a goal they can obtain, but David's sin reminds them that in the Messiah their hope should remain. Though many men try to keep the law, their strength will always wane. Their focus shifts from loving God to what their flesh can sustain. From this failure, David learned that God forgives and makes hearts new. The son born to him sought God, and since his desire was pure and true, God made him the richest and wisest man that this earth ever knew. Solomon, the third king, leads the people to pagan ways. It was from rulers seeking his wisdom that gifts and tributes they did raise. Solomon then finds his heart was torn and inevitably strays. He allows his wives and concubines to lead him to giving false gods praise. Throughout the story, God shows that relationships matter, as the book of Psalms does share the intimate communication between David and God through praise and prayer. He is found begging for God's forgiveness after his affair, and tells God of God's comfort and love while he's in deep despair. He shows that no matter what our estate, God is always aware, and that God's love for his children is well beyond compare. In Proverbs and other prophetic books, Solomon does dictate some useful instructions on living wise and ways we should relate. In topics like child raising, marriage maintaining, and having a healthy debate, his advice in life should be goals that we emulate. After Solomon dies, the nation erupts in civil war and decides to split. One kingdom worshipped false gods and did much that was unfit. The other, though imperfect, worshipped God, and to all his ways they did commit. The majority of 10 tribes together formed Israel, the northern kingdom, under the rule of the tribe of Ephraim, whose leader was Jeroboam. 2 main tribes, plus a handful of some others, joined to form Judah, the southern kingdom. They were led by the tribe of Judah, Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Israel has all ungodly, wicked kings. They imitate pagans in nearly everything. Judah had mostly bad kings, but every few generations a follower of God did spring. Kings such as Asa, Hezekiah, Jehoshaphat, and Josiah. These men tore down idols, loved God, and always did the right thing. Both kingdoms slowly spiraled downward into idolatry and sin. Their relationships with God grew shallow and transparently thin. Out of love, God decided to try and get their attention once again. God sent prophets with warnings to repent, worship, obey, and be set apart. There could be coming judgment or the restoration of those of a repentant heart. God desired to have fellowship with them as he did from the start, no matter the pleadings and messages the prophets did impart. Though there were a few exceptions, their rebellion was off the chart. The judgment of God of the kingdoms began as God's hand over them did depart. The prophesied judgment came through 2 enemy nations. Israel and Judah were both shaken to their foundations. Israel faced Assyria, and they were conquered and scattered forever. They were taken away from their homes. No ties, no bridges, and no tether. Judah and Solomon's temple were destroyed by Babylon, and then people were dispersed, separated as captives and slaves. Their healthiest and wisest were coerced to serve their captives faithfully, but they put God's laws first. This is where Daniel and his 3 friends' stories are immersed. Men like Daniel illustrate that faithfulness to God while in captivity is possible. Their trust in God shined in events that most would think implausible. Events such as surviving a night in a lion's den or walking into a burning furnace only to walk out again. Rising false prophets spoke quickly of returning home in fame, but God's true prophets corrected them and did explain. There's a long road ahead full of suffering and pain, but the Messiah would come through the tribe of Judah's veins. They assured the people that God is faithful and that hope remains. Jeremiah speaks of a new covenant not written on tablets of stone, but written on the hearts of each man when with God he does atone. Isaiah speaks of the Messiah who will die a martyr without breaking a bone, to call all men who believe on him unto his own. After 70 years, the Babylonians are conquered by the Persians, and God's people are allowed to go home to Judah just as God had vowed. Return to the promised land that God had endowed, to rebuild their homes their forefathers had worked, established, and plowed. Under leaders like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel, they worked, sifted, and cleared out all the rubble. They rebuilt the city and their defensive wall to avoid more trouble. After some jeers and tears, they rebuilt the temple in a double. From start to finish, 4 years, 3 months had passed. But they celebrated as they could worship God in his house again at last. As the Old Testament starts to close, the focus starts to slide to the coming king and his awaiting bride, with glimpses of hope now being prophesied and a dash of rebuke and correction on the side. For 400 years, the voice of God seems to subside until the introduction of a woman, barren though she tried. After over 60 years, she revealed to be with child who had already testified of Jesus from the womb, for in him did the Holy Spirit reside. So, there you go. Hope y'all enjoyed.